When you start a new game, you're going to get this cutscene where a little spark of golden light kind of floats down and lands on your hand, and this is what animates your dead, tarnished body to come back to life. Now, this little fleck of golden light we could just think of as the soul, or we could use another term called the divine spark, which has some other implications. In one version of the game, the point is to get this divine spark to escape from the physical world, which is like a prison that it's being held in, and to return to the source once again. And of course, the game tries to prevent this from happening. When Gideon tells us that Marika wants us trapped for all eternity, this could be how we interpret what he says to us before we beat him. In the last video, I interpreted Gideon's words as a little bit different than this. Essentially, he was lying to us, or maybe lying to himself. But I was also projecting my own insecurities and failures onto Gideon, and well, that may have been a mistake, even though it led to somewhere interesting for the narrative that I was going for at the time. But this version, where we're meant to be suffering for all eternity, can be kind of confusing. We kill the last boss and it says, God slain, mission accomplished, end of the suffering, right? But what comes after this point in terms of our ending choices are all just kind of, like for the most part, we're just rebooting Marika again, so we're still stuck here. So maybe our suffering that Gideon was referring to is what happens after we've actually saved Marika. But let's not dwell on these past mistakes. We're going to go somewhere a little bit new today, but also a little bit the same, and that's kind of the theme. There's more than one way to get a divine spark trapped in a prison, it seems. The main thread we're going to be following today is Sorcerer Sellen and her Primal Glintstone, as well as this idea of fate. So I'm not going to do a whole retelling of Sellen's story because I think you already know the story probably. We're just going to do like a short version. So the first time you find Sellen, she's locked away in this basement area, hidden behind this pumpkin head guy, and you just defeat this guy and get in there and speak to her. And so it turns out Sellen's like a wizard training NPC. She wants to train you in some new spells. And she also warns you to be careful who you learn from because, well, there's a lot of fake gurus out there, and she's very nice to tell us this. But it turns out Sellen has a fate not unlike many of our friendly NPCs that we encounter in this game. And again, like many of the NPCs, her fate turns out to be kind of a bad one if we decide to help her. But we'll come back to this fate idea in a minute or two. Let's talk about the Primal Glintstone first. Now, what I think has happened here with this Primal Glintstone is that Sellen has figured out some way to trap her divine spark inside of this rock structure. It's in a small, compact, portable form, but it is trapped inside this thing, and what Sellen will proceed to do is just jam this rock into a corpse of some kind and then reanimate the body in a way kind of similar to how our tarnished body was reanimated at the very beginning of the game. And so, wow, quite a technology she's developed, right? Seemingly infinite life with the only cost of needing to have new bodies once in a while, I guess. Now, it's never explained where these bodies are coming from, but I'd put my money on Celavis or maybe Vare. And we also can't really tell if these people are tarnished or maybe they're coming from the academy. Like, whoever those people are, we're not really sure, but maybe they're the same size as tarnished people. They seem to wear the same oversized Burger King helms that Sellen wears, so possibly that she's murdering these Karian Academy people and taking their bodies. But this weird, somewhat creepy way that Sellen reanimates these bodies with her Primal Glintstone is kind of not the only version of this puppetry that we find in this game. There's actually quite a few versions of puppetry going on. So the first, most obvious example of this is Celavis. He uses some kind of nefarious wizard potion to knock someone unconscious and then turn them into a puppet that way. And then from that point, maybe he turns them into a spirit summon, kind of. It seems like that's what happens. Then we've got the example of Shibiri, who takes over the bodies of Yura and Ireda, and I assume just puppets them around as well, getting them to spread the flame of frenzy. Then we've got Radagon being puppeted around in the same way by Marika and the Elden Beast, at least in my version of this story. I know a lot of people won't agree with this, but that's okay. I'm just basing this on the fact that Radagon seems to be like an empty shell and that the Elden Beast seems to like actually come out of him after we defeat him in the first phase. So it's not too crucial, and there's many ways to interpret Radagon and Marika's weirdness. Finally, we've got the form of Lunar Princess Rani that we encounter, who is literally just a puppet being controlled by a spirit. So we've got a bunch of different examples that are all hinting towards the same idea, a concept referred to as the ghost in the machine. The main idea is that a person has both a physical component and a spiritual component. In Descartes' philosophy, this was called mind body dualism, and we see similar ideas in numerous religions. And if we try to explain this, it's like the physical component of the person is being puppeted around by the spiritual component. But what this idea can sometimes lead to, and what we see definitely happening in this story, is the idea that the body is really not that important. One example of this from history and religion is something that the story seems to borrow a little bit from, at least, and this is the Gnostic beliefs. We spoke about this a little bit previously. This divine spark idea that we already brought up, that's a Gnostic belief. But when it comes to physical things, the Gnostics really believe that the physical world is kind of all evil. And so this would lead to this devaluing of the body. But it's actually this emphasis on the spiritual to the detriment of the body that I think is going to be the weakness of these wizard characters that we see in Elden Ring. But to recap this divine spark idea again, when the body dies, this divine spark is meant to kind of float away up into space, kind of thing. We actually see this in the game with the dissolving tombstones, and also with the Morgoth spirit escaping into space when he's reunited with Godfrey. So there's a bit of symbolism there, I think. But what happens is, again, that the game tries to prevent this from happening. Like, something blocks the spirits from escaping and keeps them trapped in this physical world. So Marika and her Erd tree seem to do this, obviously, with the cycling of the spirits that she does with the tarnished and everything. In this interpretation, it seems like Marika is kind of like the Demiurge character in the Gnostic beliefs. Morella does something very similar with her ghost kids. She seems to be doing some kind of like mini Demiurge activities in her classroom. And why this is, I mean, we can't be sure, but she's certainly mentally ill. And we know that Marika slash Radagon kind of did this to her, so definitely there's something happening there. And I think we can add a third example here of Sellen trapping that divine spark inside of the rock. So the rock is just a part of a physical world. I mean, it's still consistent with the previous ideas, but this version kind of bleeds into another idea as well. Here I'm talking about the idea known as panpsychism, which essentially states that consciousness is kind of in everything. So often the example is given like of a rock being conscious, like, oh, you don't think a rock is conscious, right? And well, maybe it is. Maybe it is. And that's basically panpsychism. But a rock containing consciousness, well, this could be our primal glintstone that somehow Sellen has managed to transfer her consciousness into. But what a rock is certainly not is mobile. Let's take a look at our rock-headed old sorcerers, Azur and Lusat, and what they may be telling us. Okay, so first Sorcerer Azur, we find this guy up on a mountain for some reason. Like, how did he get here? What is he doing up here? It's not clear. What does appear true is that he's been hitting this rock pretty hard up here, and he's having a lot of difficulty moving around. So he's kind of scrambled his brains up pretty good, and now he's just becoming a rock. And let's just point out the fact that, we're trying to be seeking knowledge here as wizards. Sometimes we go a little too far with the rocks, and, well, it has a negative effect. We got to be careful here, wizards. Now we go back to Selena and we tell her about this, and she's very impressed. She wants us to do a couple more, jobs for her, kind of thing. Now she's going to send us into some weird hidden away cave. So, of course, we go here and we find another one of these old wizards. This is Lusat now. Lusat, who has disappeared. He's fallen into this cave. He's been hitting the rock again, just absurdly too much rock. Is he dead? Is he alive? We can't really tell, but he is becoming a rock just like the other guy, Azur. So he's just 100% denying his body and just focusing on that mind component, right? Clearly, this much wizarding is not healthy. But okay, whatever. We talk to this guy, then we go back to talk to Sellen again, and she's very happy. And now Sellen, she gets a little bit of hubris in her. She thinks that she can kind of take over the academy. Man, I think there's a possibility here that this is a side effect of the rock. She's feeling pretty good about herself in that new body that she stole. Never had to do any exercise at all. Things are looking up for Sellen. And well, now it's time to steal the academy and become the queen, she thinks. Not a good decision, probably because of that rock again. But well, too late now to change things. This is Sellen's fate, and we've got to help her see through, or at least if we want to get some rewards. Like we don't have to help her, but considering we're tarnished and we like to get those shiny rewards, we're probably going to help her. But now with this idea of fate, we see something else has happened in her questline as well as other quest lines that are all kind of connected. We need to kill Radon, which brings the stars back into motion, and this is really the idea of fate transmitted through the game story. With the motion of the stars being held back like Radon was doing, this is delaying fate indefinitely. And when we restore the motion by killing Radon, these fates are put back into motion as well. Now, the Carians, having been descended from astrologers, are also going to be quite interested in the movement of planetary bodies. According to astrologers, your life path and your fate is somehow determined by the location of planetary bodies at the time of your birth. But even though today these astrological influences on a person's fate are not supported by mainstream science, the idea of fate or determinism is certainly not gone anywhere. And one reason for this belief actually comes from studying planetary bodies. According to Einstein's theory of general relativity, our three-dimensional space that we see changing over time is instead viewed as a four-dimensional space-time. One implication of this theory is that this steady flow of time that we experience in our everyday lives is actually relative. From a different frame of reference, time would appear to move faster or slower. And one way this apparent movement of time is affected is by planetary bodies. Massive objects in space create something called a gravitational well. And in these wells, the flow of time would slow down relative to an observer on the outside of the well. If you've seen the movie Interstellar, you'll be aware of an example of this. Some of the scientists go down to a planet that's being devoured by a black hole, so there's a massive gravitational well in this area, and this means that the flow of time for people on this planet is going to be much slower compared to the people who are on the spaceship and not being influenced as much by this gravity. But another way that we could look at this is that the people who go down to the planet whose time gets slowed down, when they return to the spaceship, it's like they've traveled into the future in a way. And so if it's possible for one person to travel into the future of another person, it's like they've seen their fate in a way, right? But of course, there's no way to know if this fate was really predetermined or if it unfolded, so it's still a mystery. These two competing ideas are known as the block universe and the growing block universe, and we don't know which one is correct. But for fun, let's try to apply this to Elden Ring, where we see General Radon stopping the stars from moving in the sky. This perspective is kind of like the guys on the spaceship looking down on the planet in Interstellar. So they're looking down on the planet. It's like time is basically slowed down to a crawl. And that's kind of what we're looking at, looking up into space in Elden Ring. It's kind of the opposite. So somehow General Radon has reversed gravity, and I guess this is why he can fly around and also whip rocks at us like they're nothing. But the modern day idea of determinism does not only come from relativity. Instead, we think of our grounded human experience and history as being the thing that determines the future. But again, I'm going to say that this astrological influence is still there because we still see this idea of matter in motion when we're looking at our history. In a much more metaphorical way, we still imagine billiard balls, kind of like stars moving through the sky. We calculate all these different variables and we determine where the future is going to be, following some predetermined path that we understand mathematically. And so, again, metaphorically, these billiard balls that we consider in our own lives have to do with our history. A few times I've used the phrase trauma circumstance midichlorians. Well, these are all billiard balls in a way. And just to unpack these ideas a little bit, when I say metachlorians, I mean genetics. Life experience includes trauma, but also includes all the positive experiences someone would have in their life. And then there's circumstance, which includes all the conditions that someone's born into over which they have no control. For example, a place in time in history, the religion you're born into, your parents and how much money they make. All these things are factors that are going to influence your life in a million different ways. But one part of circumstance that never ends is our education. You continue learning things your whole life, even though we may not think of it as learning much of the time. And it's actually this process that would allow us to transform ourselves if we were motivated to do so. All of these billiard balls of our past bring us to our present moment, and in our present moment, we can affect some change. Education is included here as well as making a decision. These activities take place in our mysterious present moment. And now we've flipped the coin and started talking about free will. When we sometimes cynically, like I have done in the past, certainly, when we say there is no free will, we're not saying there's no experience of free will. The experience of free will, at least, is real. But when we say there is no free will, what we're trying to do is take the perspective of four dimensional space time or billiard balls. Much like the astrologers, we believe that everything is just matter in motion and there's nothing we can really do to change it. This is a perspective that we get from science. But the real question has always been whether or not our experience of agency is just an experience or if it is something more than this. And because we can't actually see the future, we don't know if our apparent choices have changed anything. What we actually do is imagine a possible future, we calculate, and we assume that the future will resemble the past. And this is essentially what we call science. But it's also very similar to how we think about free will. Using this scientific type of thinking, our predictions usually work out pretty well. And when we do this, we're still being guided by some kind of desire, something that we can't control, like our will to life. Something happens in us, and we make a decision between one of these imagined future possibilities. And then between our deciding and our actions, there's a gap that appears in consciousness where we can change our decision. We can actually act against our natural will, and when we do this, it certainly looks like we have agency. It looks and feels like that, but ultimately we don't know. Whatever the objective reality bunny rabbit in itself is doing to influence our decisions is something that we're just unaware of consciously. According to some kind of desire in some imaginary future, we make decisions. So, what's the imagined future that we want? What do we desire? And can we make that happen? Also, what path are we already on? Like, what's our likely future if we don't make a change? It seems like on some level we have no choice but to make choices. Even if what we choose is to deny our desires and take no action, this is still a choice. Practically speaking, this apparent free will is all that we know we have for sure. Our observations, our desires, and our imaginings are all kind of illusions that are taking place in our head from a scientific standpoint. But without these so called illusions, we never would have arrived at a science. So, what do we do with that? But maybe the more we understand how much we are influenced and how much we are just billiard balls in motion, we'll be able to make better choices and better understand our own actions before we actually make them. In our present, we can become educated to know the difference between when we believe we're free but we're actually in chains, and when we believe we're in chains but we actually have some freedom. Not exactly new ideas. But to bring this all back together again, I want to go back to this astrology idea where in the past astrologers were kind of like scientists and they thought that they could predict the future. But at least today, from the perspective of modern science, we look back on astrologers as people who were overconfident in their answers and were seeing causality where there really wasn't any. And I think it might be a good lesson to take that we shouldn't be so confident when making predictions because we don't know what we don't know, and sometimes we can be surprised by things that look entirely random or even irrational. But let's get back to what matters Elden Ring lore. One character who thought that she had control over her own fate was Sorcerer Sellen, likely descended from one of these old astrologers. And after we defeat General Radon and put the fates back into motion, this also kickstarts Sellen's campaign. As we saw previously, Sellen believed that her fate was to take over the Carrion Academy and restore the Primeval Current. But as we just learned, when people are a little overconfident in their future predictions, things can go wrong sometimes. Sellen's real fate, unbeknownst to her, was overdetermined for failure. She would either be destroyed by Witch Hunter Jaren, or she would be trapped inside of this graven mass for all time, inside of Renala's classroom. Sellen's divine spark is trapped inside of a prison and trapped inside of another prison, with now Renala playing the Demiurge instead of Marika, or Sellen herself. Instead of the original game having to escape from a single prison, Sellen now has to escape from 3 prisons, presumably, and that's going to be pretty difficult. But if we go in the other direction, we can help Witch Hunter Jaren and just destroy her before this ever happens. Jaren says that he wants to destroy her Primal Glintstone as well, so this leads me to believe that this Primal Glintstone was operating kind of like a Horcrux in the Harry Potter wizard school. And so I guess this makes Jaren Harry Potter, and definitely not Slave Knight Gale, because I don't really know that story. But back to this Graven Mass again, it makes you wonder what the plan is here. Like maybe she'll be turned into some kind of servant for Renala and teleported into the past, maybe? Back to this idea of fate, we actually get to see what's going to happen to Sellen long before it actually happens. The second location we encounter Sellen is in the Witchbane ruins in the south of the Weeping Peninsula. And outside these ruins, we're visited by a graven mass structure, exactly like the one that we later see Sellen trapped inside of. We also find a bunch of marionette soldiers here who are servants of Karya Manor. They are puppets, just like, the other puppets that we already talked about. And so maybe it's possible that this graven mask that we find at the ruins is actually Sellen herself from the future. She's been teleported backwards in time by this wormhole thing somehow. At this exact same location, we encounter Witch Hunter Jaren, who tells us that Sellen's already dead. Now, we of course know that we've just taken her Primal Glintstone out, and that's why she's dead. But we can also just read this as foreshadowing, because we know that she will end up dead. And within a story, this foreshadowing idea is kind of like a message being sent back from the future. And that message in this case is that Sellen is going to fail, at least if we follow any of the choices that we're given. But there's one choice that we're not given that we always have as an option, and that is to just do nothing, which we can do. We have the power to do nothing, but it's easy to forget that doing nothing is doing something. We are tarnished, so our billiard balls have been put into motion to try to get these rewards. Getting those things is part of the game that we play. Unless, of course, we become self aware and override our own programming, we have the power to do this sometimes. Before you go, don't forget to click on buttons if you're so inclined. This would help me out quite a bit. And if you made it this far, I thank you, from the past to your present for some possible future. Okay, well, I might be becoming a rock now. Bye bye.